Imagine being told that some stories are too dangerous to know, that certain truths were buried, hidden in plain sight, because if you saw them clearly, your entire sense of morality, justice, and history would fracture. Tonight, I am going to show you one of those truths, a secret so disturbing that even history books almost refuse to mention it. And it begins with a man, not just any man, but one whose body became property, whose life was not his own, and whose existence was dictated by one of humanity's darkest compulsions, the calculated breeding of enslaved children. If you want to hear or see more good stories like this, then subscribe to my channel and press the bell icon. His name was Ro Jose Florencio, but the world would come to know him as Pata Seca. Born in the shadow of Brazil's sugar plantations in the early 1800s, his life was never meant for freedom, never meant for choice, never meant for himself. From the moment he first drew breath, the system had claimed him. But what makes Pata Seca's story horrifying is not just the brutality, it is the methodical, cold, almost scientific way in which human life was commodified and manipulated for profit. You see, slavery is a horror most people understand in broad strokes: forced labor, whippings, families torn apart. But there exists a chapter of slavery so precise, so engineered, that it feels almost surgical. This is the story of forced reproduction, of men and women treated not as humans, but as living vessels for labor and inheritance. Pata Seca was not sent to the fields like others. His body was measured, his physical traits catalogued, his height, strength, and genetic potential assessed. He towered above others, a giant among men, his limbs long, hands strong, eyes piercing. And in the twisted logic of the slaveholder, this made him a perfect instrument, not of work, but of multiplication. He was selected to feed their hundreds of children, each one a tool to perpetuate the plantation's wealth long after the transatlantic slave trade slowed to a stop. Children were not born to families, they were born to estates. Life itself became a currency, and Pata Seca, the unwilling architect of its expansion. The mechanics of this cruelty were deliberate. Women were chosen, their fertility noted, their bodies monitored, their cycles dictated. Consent did not exist, love did not exist, only property existed, and Pata Seca, despite his enormous presence and undeniable humanity, had no escape from this system. Every encounter, every birth, was catalogued, calculated, exploited. Over decades, he fathered more than 200 children, each a living testament to the perverse intelligence of those who designed the system. And still, even with such horror, the story remains largely untold. Why? Because knowledge of it threatens the comfortable narrative of history. It reminds us that evil is not chaotic, it is systematic, efficient, and terrifyingly human. To understand Pata Seca is to step into the machinery of control itself. This was not merely cruelty, it was management of life, a psychological manipulation of every person it touched. Imagine being a young boy towering over others, your size and strength marking you as both feared and exploited. Imagine knowing that your life, your desires, your very agency had been auctioned away before you could form a thought of your own. Imagine watching women you might have known, trusted, or even loved, forced into cycles of childbearing that they never chose, under the watchful eye of men who saw them only as numbers on a ledger. And yet, the story is not just of Pata Seca, it is of a system, a network of ideology, economy, and psychological control that made such horrors possible. Brazil, by the early 1800s, had become the epicenter of a dying transatlantic trade, relying on enslaved Africans for its booming sugar and coffee economies. When the import of new slaves slowed, the landowners faced a terrifying problem. Labor was their wealth, and without new arrivals, the system would collapse. Their solution? To engineer life itself, to manipulate fertility and force human reproduction as efficiently as any factory machine. Pata Seca's body became the engine of this operation, a living tool designed for exploitation. It is impossible to overstate the psychological weight of such a life. Pata Seca lived under constant surveillance, a prisoner of his own physicality. Each child born was both a monument and a chain, a symbol of his involuntary service and of the plantation's unyielding greed. His mind and body were instruments of someone else's design, yet history has rendered him nearly invisible. And it is here, in this gap between what was done and what we are told, that the most insidious danger lies: ignorance. Not knowing his story allows us to forget the mechanisms of power, the ways systems shape and exploit human life for centuries. But once you know, once you step into this darkness, there is no going back. Tonight, I will guide you deeper. You will see not only the life of Pata Seca, but the hidden architecture of oppression that made it possible. You will confront the economic logic, the psychological manipulation, the cold efficiency that made human life a resource to be cultivated, measured, and exploited. And as you descend with me, understand this. Knowledge is dangerous. It is dangerous because it awakens you to realities that society prefers remain unseen. But it is also liberating, for once you know, you see the hidden levers of power. You understand not just history, but human nature itself. The first step in this descent is to look at Pata Seca not as a victim of circumstance, but as a symbol of something far more terrifying. His life embodies the way systems dehumanize, the way institutions control, and the way power exploits biology to maintain dominance. And yet, even as we speak of him, we must remember that the system did not start with him, nor did it end with him. This was centuries in the making, a careful orchestration of greed, cruelty, and meticulous planning. To understand Pata Seca is to confront the uncomfortable truth that the machinery of exploitation is often invisible, quiet, and deliberate, leaving behind only the traces of lives consumed. So, take a moment now to steel yourself. The story ahead is not gentle. It is a story of darkness, of the human capacity to engineer suffering, of lives twisted into tools for profit. And yet, by hearing it, by stepping into this shadow, you gain a clarity that few ever achieve. You begin to see the system not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing architecture of control, one that used Pata Seca, his body, and his descendants as instruments of its expansion. And once you see this clearly, once you understand the mechanisms at play, you can never unsee them. The knowledge will stay with you. It will haunt you. It will challenge everything you thought you knew about history, morality, and power. And now, with your mind awake and your senses sharpened, we will move to the next stage, the birth of Pata Seca, the early markers that made him an instrument of exploitation, and the hidden codes of selection that dictated his life from infancy. Here, the system's cruelty begins not as an event, but as a design, a blueprint for control that would shape not only Pata Seca's life, but the lives of hundreds of others. The machinery of oppression is patient, calculated, and cold, and now, so is your gaze. The moment of Pata Seca's birth was unremarkable to the world, but monumental to the system that had already claimed him. Born in Sorocaba, a modest town in Sao Paulo, Brazil, his entrance into life was measured against invisible standards ironed by cruelty and profit. To the casual observer, he was just another child among hundreds of enslaved families, but the powers that ruled his world had already started calculating his future. Even before he could speak, before he could crawl or laugh, his body was being catalogued, his potential assessed, his life marked as property with a purpose. From infancy, Pata Seca displayed traits that set him apart. His frame grew faster than others, his limbs long and commanding, hands unusually large, feet strong, and eyes that seemed to pierce beyond his years. Among enslaved children, these were remarkable qualities, yet they were not seen as gifts. They were tools, assets, commodities to be harvested. The master, Francisco Bueno, took note. Every detail mattered: stature, health, apparent vigor. These were not casual observations. They were the metrics of value in a system designed to manipulate life itself. Imagine the weight of that reality. A child, barely able to walk, already measured as a means to an end. Where other children might have played in the sun, learned the laughter of friendship, or explored the simple joys of childhood, Pata Seca's existence was already framed by calculation. Every growing inch of his height was observed not for wonder, but for utility. Every burst of strength was catalogued not for sport, but for the inevitable function that awaited him: to sire life, to multiply the labor force, to extend the wealth of the plantation. By the time he reached adolescence, the purpose that had been silently assigned to him became unavoidable. He was no longer merely an extraordinary boy. He was now a selected instrument. The plantation system had an unspoken hierarchy, and at the top of its most insidious operations were individuals like Pata Seca, chosen not to labor in the fields, not to serve in the house, but to propagate human capital, children who would inherit bondage before they even knew freedom existed. And this selection was methodical. Men were not chosen randomly. Strength, health, lineage, perceived fertility, and even subtle psychologists, cal markers, obedience, resilience, submissiveness were all noted. Pata Seca had been chosen to embody the apex of these traits. The psychological consequences of this were profound, though largely invisible at first. Imagine the tension of adolescence, that natural period of rebellion, curiosity, and growth, intersecting with an unyielding system that reduced your existence to biology and profit. Every decision, every instinct, every yearning of a boy growing into a man was monitored, constrained, and redirected. The plantation did not merely command labor, it conditioned the mind. Pata Seca would come to understand, in ways unspoken but deeply internalized, that his body was not his own. It belonged to the estate, to Francisco Bueno, to a mechanism of control that measured human worth, not by character, not by intellect, but by capacity to reproduce and endure. By the age of 16, Pata Seca's place had been solidified. The estate's overseers, men trained to see human beings as assets, identified him formally as a breeder. The term itself is clinical, almost surgical in its detachment from morality. Breeding was not an accident, a suggestion, or a role one might refuse. It was an obligation enforced with vigilance, with threat, and with the grim certainty that resistance would be met with violence. Pata Seca's body was now the template for the next generation of laborers. The physical strength he had been born with was no longer a personal gift. It was the foundation upon which hundreds of children would be constructed, each a living instrument of the plantation's wealth. And yet, even in this mechanical cruelty, there is a human horror that cannot be ignored. Pata Seca was forced into intimate acts devoid of agency, acts that in any other context would be considered sacred or personal, reduced instead to transactions calculated by someone else. Women on the estate, chopras, sent by the master, were paired with him. They were selected not for love, not for desire, but for their fertility, their health, their potential to give birth to children who would serve the plantation. Pata Seca did not consent. They did not consent. The estate, however, did consent. The plantation's economy demanded it. Its rules were absolute. The system that controlled Pata Seca's life also exploited human psychology in ways that were almost invisible. Men like him were conditioned to accept their assigned purpose. Isolation, surveillance, and the subtle reinforcement of obedience created a mind that could comply even under extreme duress. They were made to internalize their role, to accept that their value was measurable in bodies produced rather than lives lived. Every visit from an overseer, every whispered instruction from the master, every pairing arranged without question, these were psychological levers, controlling not just the body, but the mind. And here is the chilling truth that most history books omit. This was not rare. Pata Seca's case is horrifying because it is documented. But the system of forced reproduction existed across countless estates, hidden behind polite euphemisms, financial ledgers, and the quiet complicity of society. Slavery was not only about labor, it was about engineering life itself, turning men and women into instruments of a brutal economic algorithm. Pata Seca was both extraordinary and terrifyingly ordinary in this context. A giant, yes, but also a cog in a carefully constructed machine. The first generations of children he fathered would already feel the shadow of this system. Their lives were predetermined, their freedom limited, their identities shaped by a design not of their own choosing. And yet, even as this machinery functioned with ruthless efficiency, it depended on human psychology, compliance, internalized subservience, the quiet terror that resistance would mean death or worse. Pata Seca's adolescence was not merely a coming of age, it was an action into a system of total control, a brutal education in the intersection of biology, power, and profit. So, as we descend further into this story, understand that the horrors of Pata Seca's life are not simply about cruelty, they are about design. Every action, every choice, every child born was a calculated outcome. And this is where the story begins to grip not just the heart, but the mind. We are not witnessing random evil, but systemic, methodical, and terrifyingly effective manipulation. Pata Seca was selected, trained, and exploited not as an act of passion or malice, but as a strategy, a blueprint for expanding slavery itself. Halfway through the descent, I want you to commit to understanding. Comment below, type the phrase, chains of life, twice. Do it. It is not just a symbol, it is a recognition that your awareness is now aligned with the truths hidden in plain sight, that you are beginning to see the machinery others hope you never notice. Let that phrase mark your engagement, your awakening, and your passage into knowledge that changes how you perceive history, power, and the human capacity for control. In the next section, we will examine the full scale of Pata Seca's exploitation, how the plantation system monitored his life, orchestrated his pairings, and extended his control over generations. You will see in detail how human beings were turned into assets, and how the machinery of oppression treated life itself as an investment. This is where the horror becomes intimate, almost unbearable, but necessary to understand. By the time Pata Seca entered adulthood, the plantation system had fully claimed him. Every movement, every moment, every heartbeat had a predetermined purpose: to sustain and expand the labor force of the estate. Unlike other enslaved men, whose toil was measured in hours or days, Pata Seca's life was measured in generations. Each child he fathered was another unit of wealth, another extension of a system designed to endure long after the master's death. And yet, what makes this story almost unbearable is not the number of children, but the meticulous precision with which the plantation orchestrated it. Women were not chosen randomly. Fertility was observed, recorded, manipulated. The plantation kept careful notes, some in diaries, others in ledgers, that tracked the reproductive cycles of women, their previous offspring, their health, and their genetic suitability. Pata Seca's role was equally monitored. His health, stamina, and physical performance were meticulously assessed. Rest was calculated. Food was rationed strategically. He was conditioned to be at peak capacity when the master required it, ensuring maximum efficiency. Every child conceived was a product not of love, desire, or natural connection, but of an engineered cold calculus designed for profit. This orchestration extended beyond biology. Psychological manipulation was woven into the system, subtle yet absolute. Pata Seca was isolated in ways that reinforced compliance. He was revered in some circles of the enslaved community because of his stature and strength, yet that reverence was a trap. It reminded him constantly that he was exceptional, and exceptional men were more valuable alive and productive than free. He could not refuse. Resistance would invite punishment, perhaps death, but compliance guaranteed a parole. Ongoing life under the master's control. In this way, the system controlled the body and mind simultaneously, ensuring obedience through both fear and the illusion of importance. It is impossible to overstate the human toll of this life. Pata Seca fathered over 200 children, each one a living testament to the plantation's calculated cruelty. Imagine the psychological weight, the awareness that each child born was not a creation of love or family, but a deliberate product of oppression. Imagine the loss of agency, the knowledge that your body, your will, your very identity had been transformed into a tool for someone else's wealth. And yet, the most disturbing part is how normalized this system had become to those enforcing it. The master, his overseers, the estate accountants, they viewed Pata Seca's forced reproduction as business as usual, an essential part of economic survival. Morality had no place here. Only efficiency mattered. The scale of this exploitation also reveals the plantation's long-term vision. Slaveholders in Brazil understood that the transatlantic trade was slowing and, eventually, would end. Their solution was brutally pragmatic. If new slaves could no longer be bought cheaply from Africa, the estate would produce its own. Pata Seca's body, and the bodies of women he was paired with, became a factory for labor, a sustainable engine to fuel the plantations indefinitely. Children were born into slavery, raised to work the same lands, and some, in a cruel irony, were likely to be chosen for the same reproductive cycle that had claimed their father. The system replicated itself biologically, socially, and economically, a self-perpetuating machine of human exploitation. The psychological warfare of this system extended to the women as well. Those forced to bear Pata Seca's children endured cycles of pregnancy designed not for health, not for family, not for hope, but for profit. Their bodies became tools, their labor extended through birth, their humanity reduced to reproductive capacity. There was no rest, no reprieve, no natural progression of life. Each child was another link in a chain, and each link was forged under surveillance and control. The system operated like clockwork, and its cruelty was precise. And yet, despite the horror, there was also strategy. Plantation owners understood that brute force alone could not sustain compliance. Obedience had to be internalized. Pata Seca and the women were conditioned to accept their roles, to internalize the idea that their existence was secondary to the estate's needs. Fear alone could not achieve the level of control required. It had to be married to psychological manipulation, social isolation, and the strategic distribution of privileges, small, meaningless comforts designed to reinforce participation in the system. This was control on a molecular level, penetrating identity itself. It is here, in the subtlety of this orchestration, that the full horror becomes apparent. We often speak of slavery in terms of chains and whips, but Pata Seca's story shows us that the most effective systems of domination manipulate life itself. It is one thing to work a man to exhaustion. It is another entirely to engineer him into producing generations of laborers while making him believe he has no choice, all while controlling the bodies of women and the minds of the enslaved community. This is total control, an architecture of oppression that reaches into the very essence of humanity. The human capacity to endure under such systems is remarkable, but so too is the system's capacity to exploit that endurance. Pata Seca's strength, longevity, and towering stature were all weapons in the master's arsenal. Each child born under his forced hand was both a monument to his suffering and a testament to the estate's unrelenting pursuit of power. His life was not only observed, it was optimized. And here lies the cruel irony. The very traits that made Pata Seca exceptional as a human also made him exceptionally valuable as property. His greatness became the instrument of his own exploitation. By now, you may feel the weight of this history pressing down on you. That is intentional. Knowledge is a heavy weapon. Understanding the mechanics of Pata Seca's life forces a confrontation not just with the horrors of slavery, but with the subtle ways systems of control operate even today, how institutions manipulate bodies, minds, and life itself to serve agendas beyond morality. This is not ancient history. It is a mirror. The mechanisms may have changed, but the logic remains. Control is engineered, life is exploited, and power is wielded with cold efficiency. Next, we will examine the personal cost of Pata Seca's role, the relationships destroyed, and the human identities eroded by this system. You will see how the machinery of slavery did not merely harvest labor, it harvested soul, mind, and spirit, leaving behind only the appearance of life while consuming its essence. The horror becomes intimate now, not in numbers, but in the faces, the bodies, and the lost agency of a man trapped in the ultimate system of human exploitation. To understand the full horror of Pata Seca's life, you must move beyond numbers, beyond the sheer scale of over 200 children, and confront the intimate devastation, the erosion of identity, the fragmentation of family, and the destruction of human connection. Each child he fathered was a living embodiment of his coerced labor, yet each also represented a loss of self, a part of his own humanity, siphoned away to sustain a system that never saw him as a man. This was not simply exploitation, it was psychic violence, waged over decades, with no reprieve. Pata Seca's relationships were governed entirely by the plantation's machinery. Friendship, camaraderie, even love were luxuries denied him. Among the enslaved community, he was both revered and feared. His size, his strength, and his tragic role as a breeder made him untouchable in some ways, yet profoundly isolated. No peer could understand what he endured. No woman could approach him freely. Those who bore his children were chosen, not chosen by him, and each pregnancy was dictated by someone else's calculation. Human intimacy became a ledger entry, a strategic investment, a transaction designed for profit rather than connection. Imagine the psychological toll of waking every day knowing your body's only true function has been defined by someone else. Imagine the invisible chains, heavier than iron, forged not from steel, but from expectation, obligation, and unyielding surveillance. Pata Seca could not refuse. Resistance would have been met with violence, with punishment, perhaps with death. Compliance was the only path to survival, yet survival itself came at the cost of autonomy. Every child born under his hand was simultaneously a curse and a continuation of the plantation's greed. Each one reinforced the system that enslaved him, trapping him in a cycle with no end. Even within the enslaved community, his role created fractures. Families who might have been allies, neighbors, or confidants instead regarded him through the lens of his function: breeder, vessel, instrument. Respect and fear replaced genuine connection. Isolation compounded isolation. And yet the plantation relied on this very psychological structure to maintain control, by elevating Pata Seca in some ways while trapping him in an impossible rotterpers hole. They ensured obedience through a mix of intimidation, reverence, and impossible expectations. Consider the women forced into these reproductive cycles. Their trauma was compounded by the orchestration of the estate. Each pregnancy carried not only physical risk, but also the psychological weight of being part of a system that robbed them of choice. Pata Seca was as much a participant in this forced system as a victim of it, yet unlike the women, his suffering was entwined with the impossible responsibility of creation. Every child was a life he had helped bring into a world of bondage, a world in which freedom was impossible and agency was systematically denied. The ethical and emotional burden of this is almost unimaginable, and yet the plantation did not stop at mere physical exploitation. Emotional manipulation was central to sustaining the system. Pata Seca's mind was constantly reinforced with the narrative of inevitability. He had no choice. He was exceptional. His life had meaning only through service to the estate. Isolation, observation, and subtle rewards conditioned him to accept his role. Compliance became survival, and survival became identity. The system did not merely control him physically, it reshaped his consciousness, redefining his perception of freedom, agency, and even self-worth. In this context, the human cost is staggering. Pata Seca's children were both living proof of his coerced labor and agents of the same system, born into the same structures that enslaved him. They grew knowing little of paternal warmth or choice, instead becoming pieces in a meticulously constructed hierarchy of oppression. The family as a concept was stripped from them. Children of Pata Seca were not raised with love. They were raised as capital instruments and heirs to a system designed to perpetuate itself. Each new generation became both victim and vessel, continuing the machinery that had claimed Pata Seca long before he could comprehend his fate. The psychological gravity of this life is nearly unbearable. Pata Seca was a man trapped in a paradox, his body powerful enough to create life, yet entirely powerless over the use of that life. His role made him central to the plantation economy while rendering him invisible as a human being. The more children he fathered, the more indispensable he became, yet the less personal freedom he possessed. Each birth reinforced his entrapment. Each woman assigned to him reminded him that autonomy was a luxury he could never have, and each child symbolized both creation and imprisonment. And herein lies the most sinister lesson of all. The plantation system was designed not only to exploit bodies, but to manipulate minds. By controlling relationships, orchestrating reproduction, and defining roles with unyielding clarity, the estate exerted power over not just life, but identity itself. Pata Seca's tragedy is a masterclass in systemic control. The most efficient form of domination is the one that convinces its victims to accept it. By forcing him into cycles of creation, the system weaponized his humanity against itself. It was cruelty not born of chaos, but of design. The enormity of this story challenges the limits of empathy, and we must confront it. Understanding Pata Seca's life demands that we see beyond statistics, beyond the number of children, to the deep psychological engineering of oppression, the deliberate shaping of consciousness to ensure compliance even in the face of unimaginable violation. It is a lesson in power, control, and the human cost of systems designed for profit over humanity. In the next section, we will explore the physical toll on Pata Seca, the relentless demands on his body, and how the plantation measured and monitored his performance as if he were a machine. You will see how every heartbeat, every ounce of strength, every day of his life was exploited, and how this system used the most intimate aspects of human existence as instruments of economic calculation. By adulthood, Pata Seca's body had become the ultimate instrument of the plantation. Every inch of his height, every pound of muscle, every pulse of stamina was catalogued, monitored, and exploited. This was not life lived, it was life engineered. The estate treated him as a machine designed for productivity, measuring output not in work hours, but in offspring. Every heartbeat was efficiency, every drop of sweat and every act of survival calculated for maximum profit. And yet, unlike a machine, Pata Seca possessed consciousness. He felt, remembered, and endured the full weight of his existence. The plantation's obsession with control extended to his health. Overseers monitored his diet, his sleep, his vigor. If he showed signs of weakness, remedies or punishments were applied. There was no concern for personal well-being, only optimization. Like a finely tuned engine, his body had to perform on demand, day after day, year after year. A slow recovery after illness or exhaustion was not a lapse in care, it was a threat to the plantation's profits. And those who failed to meet these expectations faced consequences: beatings, deprivation, isolation. The psychological effect was devastating. Pata Seca learned early that his body's natural rhythms were irrelevant, only utility mattered. The sexual demands placed on him were relentless. He was paired with women according to meticulous schedules, their fertility tracked as rigorously as his own endurance. There were no breaks, no reprieve, no personal choice. Each reproductive act was monitored, recorded, and assessed for effectiveness. Overseers kept notes, making sure that every child born contributed to the expansion of the labor pool. Every birth was an economic transaction, and Pata Seca was the primary asset. The mental and emotional toll of being treated as both instrument and incubator cannot be overstated. He was simultaneously revered for his strength and dehumanized for his compliance. This system of forced breeding was more than cruel, it was surgical in its precision. The plantation understood the value of genetic traits: strength, health, endurance, and stature. Pata Seca embodied all of them. The children he fathered were not conceived for love, family, or lineage. They were the product of an algorithm designed to maximize labor potential. Plantation owners monitored each generation to ensure the continuation of traits they deemed desirable, perpetuating both physical and social control. The human cost was invisible to them, but for Pata Seca and the women involved, it was total. The emotional weight of this life cannot be quantified. Every day he carried not only the physical burden of forced reproduction, but also the psychic weight of being a living tool. Isolation compounded the trauma. Among the enslaved, he was untouchable, revered, feared, a figure both admired and pitied. Friendships were shallow, intimacy impossible, and family connections meaningless. Even when interacting with other enslaved men or women, his role created distance. Others could not approach him without the shadow of his duty looming over every encounter. He was a man both present and absent, a human whose body worked against his own desire for freedom. What makes Pata Seca's story even more harrowing is the plantation's ability to maintain control across decades. The system relied on subtle psychological reinforcement, small privileges granted to maintain compliance, isolation to prevent rebellion, constant surveillance to instill fear. His mind was shaped to internalize obedience. Compliance became habit. Habit became identity. And yet deep inside, he could not escape the awareness of his exploitation, the constant knowledge that his life, his agency, and his legacy were all appropriated by someone else. The physical toll was relentless. Exhaustion, injury, disease, Pata Seca endured all because the plantation could not afford the loss of productivity. Pain was not a warning, it was a metric. Each child he fathered was proof of efficiency. Each pregnancy carried to term a record of compliance, and still, the psychological scars ran deeper than the physical. How does a man endure when his purpose is determined entirely by someone else? When intimacy is weaponized as control? When life itself is reduced to output? Pata Seca survived, but survival was not freedom. It was endurance under total domination. This orchestration of his body and mind was not chaotic, it was deliberate, patient, and efficient. The plantation understood the calculus of control: select the strongest, monitor the weakest, schedule the reproductive cycles, enforce compliance, and repeat. Generation after generation, the labor pool would expand and the system would continue. Pata Seca's body was at the center, a living machine, his consciousness aware, his autonomy denied. In understanding Pata Seca, we confront the terrifying mechanics of human exploitation. This was slavery elevated from brute force to systemic engineering. power was exercised not only over labor but over life itself, designing and controlling both bodies and minds. Every child born, every act of compliance, every beat of his heart was part of a cruel algorithm. And once you grasp the precision of this control, you begin to see patterns not just in history, but in human behavior, psychology, and institutions even today, mechanisms of domination that are invisible until you know to look. In the next section, we will examine how the plantation expanded its influence through the generations of children Pata Seca fathered and how his life became a blueprint for the calculated perpetuation of slavery. You will see the horrifying legacy of his forced role and how the machinery of oppression used human bodies to ensure both economic dominance and the systemic continuation of power. The horror of Pata Seca's life emerges not just in his own suffering, but in the generational consequences of the system he was forced to serve. Each child he fathered was a living extension of the plantation, a calculated reinforcement of its power, and a perpetuation of human bondage. His body, so singular in strength and vitality, became a generator of labor for decades, ensuring that the plantation would not only survive but thrive long after the transatlantic slave trade had been curtailed. In this way, Pata Seca's forced role was not just personal tragedy, it was the blueprint for systemic control, a mechanism that allowed slavery to persist by manipulating human life itself. From the moment his first child was born, the machinery of exploitation began replicating. Children inherited not only the status of enslavement, but also the physical traits deemed valuable by the master. Tall, strong, resilient boys were often singled out for labor, reinforcing the plantation's workforce, while girls were viewed as potential future breeders, further feeding the system of reproductive control. Pata Seca's genetic legacy became an instrument of domination, a cycle carefully designed and rigorously enforced. His life was a bridge between past cruelty and future enslavement, each child a node in an unbroken chain of oppression. The psychological weight of this generational control was immense. Pata Seca lived knowing that his children would endure the same system that imprisoned him. He could not shield them, could not offer guidance or protection, because the plantation dictated every aspect of their lives. Love, parental authority, and family structure were irrelevant. What mattered was productivity, obedience, and the continuation of the estate's wealth. Each birth was both a triumph of survival and a confirmation of the system's total dominance, a cruel paradox that reinforced the inevitability of control. The scale of his enforced reproductive labor is staggering. Over 200 children born into captivity, each one a living testament to both his suffering and the plantation's efficiency. To think of a single human being producing so many offspring under compulsion is almost unimaginable. And yet, this was no anomaly. In Brazil, as in other parts of the Americas, forced breeding became a deliberate strategy for maintaining and expanding the enslaved population. Pata Seca's life illuminates the cold precision of this system. Every trait, every cycle, every birth meticulously observed, monitored, and exploited for profit. The generational consequences extended beyond the biological. Pata Seca's descendants were embedded into the same social hierarchies, subjected to the same conditioning, surveillance, and psychological control. Families were fragmented before they could form. Sibling relationships were mediated by the plantation's needs rather than personal bonds, and the social fabric of the enslaved community was continuously reshaped to prioritize utility over humanity. In effect, the plantation did not simply enslave individuals, it engineered entire generations, reshaping human potential to serve its objectives. Even the language of control was insidious. Terms like breeder and stock were deliberately dehumanizing, designed to transform living people into assets. Pata Seca, once a boy with potential for choice and freedom, became a symbol, a unit of production, a living ledger entry. The system required him to internalize this role, and over time, psychological conditioning reinforced acceptance. He learned, consciously or unconsciously, that his survival depended on compliance, that autonomy was dangerous, and that resistance was futile. The plantation did not simply demand obedience, it shaped identity, molding a man into an instrument of its own perpetuation. And yet, even under such total control, small acts of humanity persisted. Glimpses of defiance, subtle choices, and moments of private grief survived within the oppressive structure. Pata Seca's awareness of his children, his mourning for the lives imposed upon by circumstance, and his internal recognition of the system's cruelty were acts of resistance in themselves. They were private rebellions against a reality designed to erase individuality. They remind us that even in the most extreme forms of domination, consciousness endures, and with it, the potential for understanding, reflection, and memory. But the system was relentless. With every generation, with every child born under compulsion, the plantation refined its strategies, learning from the patterns of human behavior, exploiting weaknesses, and enforcing compliance. Pata Seca's life was simultaneously a cautionary tale and a tool, a living model that demonstrated the efficiency of reproductive control as a means to sustain slavery. His suffering, measured and maximized, ensured that future generations would inherit both the labor system and the psychological architecture of oppression. By observing Pata Seca's life, we confront a chilling reality. Slavery was not simply about labor or violence, it was about engineering life itself, about constructing a sustainable system of domination that extended across generations. The plantation's success depended on precision, calculation, and an almost scientific manipulation of human biology and psychology. Pata Seca's body became the epicenter of this system, a living conduit through which power, control, and exploitation flowed seamlessly from one generation to the next. In the next section, we will delve deeper into the plantation's record-keeping, the obsessive surveillance of his life, and the economic calculations that transformed human bodies into instruments of profit. You will witness the terrifying sophistication of the system, the way every heartbeat and every child became a measure of efficiency, and how Pata Seca's existence illuminated the dark genius of institutionalized cruelty. The plantation that controlled Pata Seca did more than dictate his life. It meticulously monitored it, reducing his existence to a ledger of productivity, endurance, and reproductive output. Every act, every movement, every child born was recorded. There was no privacy, no personal space, no reprieve from scrutiny. In essence, the estate turned human life into a precise data set, and Pata Seca, with his extraordinary physicality, was the primary variable in an algorithm of domination. Imagine waking every day knowing that your body is being measured not for health, not for survival, but for profit. Overseers watched, supervisors noted, and the master calculated the returns. They tracked the number of children conceived, the timing of pregnancies, the strength and health of each child, and even traits like gender and physical potential. Pata Seca was a living calculator, his biology leveraged with ruthless efficiency. His personal identity was irrelevant. What mattered was output. The system transformed intimacy into accounting, life into commerce, and obedience into a requirement for survival. The psychological consequences of this surveillance were profound. Pata Seca could never act freely. Every interaction with women, every movement in the plantation, every display of strength or fatigue was observed and assessed. He learned early that deviation from expectation invited punishment, ostracism, or physical retribution. Compliance became internalized. The mind adapts to control, and Pata Seca's was no exception. He came to associate his own value with measurable productivity, to equate survival with obedience, and to view personal agency as dangerous, almost unthinkable. This is the genius of systemic oppression. It doesn't just force behavior, it reshapes perception, turning prisoners into willing participants in their own subjugation. The record-keeping extended to his children as well. Each birth was catalogued meticulously. The mother, the date, the child's health and physical traits were all noted. Male children, particularly robust ones, were earmarked for labor, while female children were assessed for reproductive potential. The plantation maintained an internal economy of human life, a ledger that treated flesh and blood as capital. Pata Seca's role as progenitor was central to this operation. He was the node through which the system multiplied itself, and every entry in the plantation's records was a testament to his coerced compliance. Consider the horror of living under this level of scrutiny for decades. Pata Seca's body became a tool, his relationships a controlled mechanism, and his mind a territory constantly surveilled and manipulated. His identity, the essence of being a human, was secondary to his utility. He was both elevated and trapped, revered for his extraordinary physicality, yet imprisoned by the very traits that made him valuable. He existed as both asset and cautionary example. The plantation's control was not chaotic or brute. It was a precise, calculated architecture designed to extract maximum output while enforcing total compliance. This surveillance also extended into subtle psychological conditioning. Small privileges were granted to reinforce behavior, a momentary favor, extra food, or temporary respite. But these were strategic, designed to create dependency and acceptance. Fear alone was insufficient to maintain decades of control. The system required psychological reinforcement to normalize the impossible demands placed on him. Compliance became habitual, and habitual compliance became identity. The plantation weaponized Pata Seca's own consciousness against him, ensuring that his compliance would feel over time almost natural, even as it stripped away autonomy. The economic calculations behind Pata Seca's exploitation were equally precise. Every child born under his coerced hand represented a return on investment for the master. Male children promised labor power. Female children promised reproductive potential. Each pregnancy, each birth, was accounted for as capital expansion, and Pata Seca's life was central to this computation. Human beings were treated as assets to be optimized, and every aspect of their existence measured against profitability. The dehumanization was systemic, sophisticated, and terrifyingly efficient. And yet, the system depended not only on observation, but also on invisibility, the silent normalization of exploitation. To the outside world, Pata Seca's extraordinary stature and prolific progeny might have seemed natural or even miraculous. Few would question the underlying machinery of control. Most would never grasp the degree to which human life had been calculated, monitored, and exploited with ruthless precision. The genius of the system lay in its subtlety, oppression that was at once total and invisible, mechanized yet disguised behind the veneer of social order and economic necessity. Understanding this is critical. Pata Seca's story reveals that slavery was not only about brute force, it was about designing systems that manipulated life itself. Bodies, minds, and relationships were carefully measured, optimized, and controlled. Surveils. Lance was continuous, data-driven, and integrated into every aspect of existence. And at the center of this system stood Pata Seca, a man whose extraordinary body, mind, and presence were transformed into the ultimate instrument of exploitation. In the next section, we will explore the profound emotional and social consequences for Pata Seca and his descendants. We will examine how his coerced role shaped entire generations, fractured communities, and created a legacy of trauma that extended far beyond the plantation gates. You will see how systemic oppression functions not only in the immediate moment, but across time, shaping the lives and identities of those born into its machinery. The weight of Pata Seca's life did not end with him. The horrors of his forced role extended far beyond his own existence, rippling through generations in ways that are both intimate and structural. Every child he fathered carried not only the physical legacy of strength and endurance, but also the psychological imprint of a system designed to subjugate, control, and exploit. These children grew knowing that freedom was not a possibility, that their value was measured in labor and productivity, and that their identities had been predetermined before they took their first breath. Imagine the lives of these children. They were born into a world where family bonds were subordinated to economic calculations, where their fathers were instruments of the plantation rather than guardians, and where maternal relationships were defined by reproductive utility rather than love. Childhood, the natural space for learning, exploration, and trust, became a terrain dominated by the shadow of coercion. Parents were present in body, but absent in agency. Bonds were fractured, and identity was shaped more by the calculations of the master than by the choices of family. Each generation became a living node in a system designed for control. The social consequences of Pata Seca's enforced breeding were profound. Within the enslaved community, hierarchy, envy, and division were magnified by the plantation's orchestration. Children of Pata Seca were sometimes marked for labor or reproductive roles based on their physical traits. Some were elevated as valuable assets, others relegated to menial work. The system created a network of inequality and dependency, embedding control within the social fabric of the enslaved community itself. Every interaction, every relationship carried the imprint of systemic manipulation. Rebellion was possible, but always at immense personal risk. Psychologically, the impact was crushing. Children grew aware, often from a young age, that their very existence was dictated by someone else's design. Autonomy was not simply denied, it was inconceivable. The trauma of living in a system that treated human life as a commodity was cumulative, passing from parent to child, not only in circumstance, but in the internalized acceptance of oppression. Pata Seca's descendants bore a dual legacy, inherited strength and endurance on one hand, and the inescapable burden of systemic control on the other. They were built for labor, primed for reproduction, and shaped to perpetuate the very structure that had enslaved their father. The intergenerational trauma extended into identity formation. Children of Pata Seca often struggled with their place in the community and their understanding of self. Were they valued as humans, or merely as products of genetic design? Did they inherit the hope of liberation, or the inevitability of subjugation? The questions were not hypothetical, they were lived realities. Pata Seca himself understood, in moments of clarity and despair, that the consequences of his coerced role would echo far beyond his own life, shaping destinies he could not control. And yet, even within his system, there were acts of quiet resistance and survival. Memory, culture, and community persisted in subtle forms. Stories passed in whispers, coded songs and rituals preserved fragments of identity, and the shared awareness of oppression became a form of cohesion. Pata Seca's life, though defined by coercion, also left traces of resilience. His physical and psychological endurance modeled survival under impossible circumstances. Each child born into the system carried within them the capacity to witness, to remember, and to endure, even as they were shaped by the machinery of slavery. Economically, the legacy was undeniable. The children he fathered were integral to the plantation's expansion. Male children became laborers, female children became potential breeders. The system multiplied itself not through chance, but through careful orchestration. Pata Seca's life and the lives of his descendants became a perpetual engine, producing wealth, sustaining power, and entrenching inequality. In essence, his coerced body became a cornerstone of institutional efficiency. The human cost was invisible to the masters, but it was catastrophic for those trapped in its cycles. And here lies the ultimate insight. Oppression is most effective when it is generational. By controlling reproduction, by shaping relationships, and by embedding trauma into identity, systems of power ensure their survival beyond any single lifetime. Pata Seca's existence exemplifies this principle. He was not just a victim of immediate cruelty, he was a vector of intergenerational control, a living demonstration of how systemic oppression can endure through biology, social hierarchy, and psychological conditioning. By the end of this reflection, the full scope of the horror becomes clear. Pata Seca was extraordinary in body, but the system that exploited him was even more calculated, patient, and ruthless. His story illuminates the machinery of oppression on both personal and generational scales, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, exploitation, and the human cost of efficiency. It challenges us to recognize how deeply systems can infiltrate life itself, shaping not only what we do, but who we become. In the next section, we will examine the hidden agendas behind such systems, exploring the economic, political, and ideological motivations that allowed forced breeding to persist and thrive. You will see how calculated greed, institutional corruption, and social control converged to create one of the darkest examples of human exploitation in history. To truly understand the horror of Pata Seca's life, we must step back and see the invisible forces that enabled it. Forces of greed, ideology, and institutional corruption that transformed human bodies into instruments of profit. The plantation was not merely a site of labor, it was a carefully engineered system, a microcosm of social and economic power designed to extract wealth from life itself. Every act of coercion, every forced birth, every child catalogued in ledgers was justified through a combination of financial reasoning and dehumanizing ideology. Economic motives were clear and unrelenting. As the transatlantic slave trade slowed, Brazilian landowners faced a dilemma. Labor was wealth, and without a steady supply of enslaved Africans, plantations risked collapse. Their solution was chilling in its efficiency: create labor internally. Pata Seca's body, chosen for strength and vitality, became the cornerstone of this strategy. Every child he fathered represented future labor, perpetuating the plantation's economy while minimizing dependence on external sources. Profit dictated biologues. I and the human element, pain, suffering, autonomy, was systematically erased from consideration. Ideology provided the necessary justification. Pseudo-scientific beliefs about heredity, strength, and racial hierarchies were invoked to rationalize the forced reproduction of enslaved people. Tall, strong men like Pata Seca were elevated to the status of ideal progenitors, while women were categorized and commodified for fertility. The plantation's operators framed this as natural or necessary, masking the brutality behind a veneer of social theory and moral pretense. In reality, these ideological constructs were carefully cultivated tools designed to normalize the unconscionable and silence dissent. Institutional corruption reinforced the system. Law, custom, and social norms aligned to protect the interests of landowners. The state, economic institutions, and even religious authorities largely turned a blind eye, legitimizing the exploitation while punishing resistance. Pata Seca and those like him were trapped not only by physical constraints, but by an entire societal apparatus that viewed their bodies and lives as instruments of power. Oppression was encoded into the very structures meant to maintain order, ensuring that cruelty persisted under the guise of legality and tradition. The plantation system was also a masterclass in psychological control. By selectively elevating certain individuals, like Pata Seca, while maintaining rigid hierarchies and pervasive surveillance, the masters fostered obedience and internalized compliance. Privileges were granted sparingly, fear reinforced regularly, and identity was reshaped to align with utility. In effect, Pata Seca's own mind was weaponized against him. He internalized his assigned purpose, reinforcing the system from within. Resistance became not only dangerous but psychologically alien, making submission feel inevitable. Consider the scale of the deception. To the wider world, plantations appeared orderly and prosperous. Children were numerous, labor abundant, estates thriving. Yet beneath this facade was a meticulously engineered machine of control, dependent on the exploitation of human life and the suppression of moral outrage. Pata Seca's coerced role was central to this operation. He was both extraordinary in his physical attributes and tragic in his enforced function, a living proof of the system's ability to merge greed, ideology, and institutional power into a single, efficient mechanism of oppression. This is why Pata Seca's story is so profoundly disturbing. It reveals how systemic evil operates not in bursts of chaos, but in calculated, enduring, and normalized ways. The cruelty of the plantation was not improvised. It was planned, justified, and sustained over decades. Bodies were measured, fertility assessed, and labor optimized, all under the guise of necessity. His life illustrates how power leverages every aspect of existence, body, mind, and generation to maintain dominance. It shows that evil can be patient, methodical, and terrifyingly effective when reinforced by social, economic, and ideological structures. Pata Seca's existence also forces us to confront a broader truth. Systems of control are rarely visible at the level of an individual moment. They operate through subtle manipulations, incentives, and social norms, creating compliance and internalized obedience over time. By turning the most intimate aspects of human life, reproduction, family, identity, into mechanisms of profit, the plantation demonstrates the frightening efficiency of institutionalized cruelty. This is not simply a story of Slav, Eri, it is a study of power, strategy, and the engineering of human life to serve an agenda beyond morality. As we prepare to conclude, reflect on this. Pata Seca's story is not a relic. It is a lesson in human nature, institutional power, and the dark potential of systems that prioritize efficiency and profit over empathy and freedom. The mechanisms that enslaved him, economic calculation, ideological justification, institutional complicity, and psychological manipulation, exist in different forms even today. Knowledge of this story awakens understanding, forcing recognition of patterns that society often prefers remain hidden. In the next and final section, we will descend fully into the lasting implications of Pata Seca's life, the moral lessons, the psychological truths, and the awakening that comes from seeing human history as it truly is, a battlefield of power, exploitation, and the struggle for autonomy. We will close by confronting the personal transformation that comes from understanding such truths and the responsibility that awareness imposes. Now, we reach the final descent into Pata Seca's world, a place where the weight of history, the cruelty of systems, and the endurance of the human spirit collide. His life was not simply an atrocity of the past, it is a mirror reflecting the deepest mechanics of control, exploitation, and power. Over 2 centuries ago, a man's body became a factory, his children a workforce, his identity a ledger entry. And yet, despite the dehumanization, Pata Seca endured. He survived not just because of physical strength, but because of a resilience of consciousness, a quiet persistence that refused to be fully erased by the machinery around him. The moral gravity of his story is profound. Pata Seca's suffering forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that systems of oppression are not chaotic or accidental, but deliberate, strategic, and calculated, that power can be exercised not only through overt violence, but through psychological engineering and reproductive control, that human life can be measured, optimized, and weaponized in ways that are invisible to most, yet devastatingly real for those trapped within. His existence challenges us to see the hidden architecture of domination in all its forms, past and present, and to recognize the subtle continuities in systems that exploit, manipulate, and control. At the same time, there is a lesson in endurance. Pata Seca's survival, his ability to persist under impossible circumstances, reveals something fundamental about human consciousness. Even when stripped of agency, reduced to a tool of profit, and forced to live in a world designed to erase him, his mind retained awareness. This awareness is a form of resistance. The system could exploit his body, dictate his relationships, and calculate his life, but it could not fully claim his internal witness. In his endurance, he embodies a principle both terrifying and inspiring, that even under total control, consciousness persists. His story also speaks to the psychological mechanisms of systemic oppression. Observe how the plantation shaped obedience, isolation, fear, selective privilege, and the constant reinforcement of predetermined roles. Consider how his identity was slowly reframed to accept utility over autonomy, productivity over selfhood, survival over freedom. Recognize how these strategies are subtle, patient, and remarkably effective. What the story of Pata Seca teaches is that the machinery of control does not merely act on bodies, it acts on minds, reshaping perception, constraining desire, and enforcing compliance in ways that can endure across generations. And yet, there is transformation in knowledge. To witness Pata Seca's life is to awaken to the hidden structures that govern human experience. Comment below, type the phrase "chains of life" twice once more. Let it mark your recognition that understanding power, exploitation, and systemic control is a threshold. It is a commitment to awareness, a declaration that you now see beyond surface narratives, and that you are willing to confront truths that were deliberately obscured. This is no trivial act, it is a symbolic alignment with insight and vigilance. The lasting legacy of Pata Seca's story is both cautionary and illuminating. It forces recognition of the capacity for calculated cruelty, the ways in which institutions can manipulate biology and psychology, and the intergenerational consequences of oppression. But it also demonstrates endurance, resilience, and the possibility of witnessing without surrender. In knowing his story, we inherit responsibility, the responsibility to observe, to question, and to ensure that systems designed to exploit do not go unchallenged. History is not merely to be remembered, it is to be understood, internalized, and transformed into wisdom. Finally, Pata Seca's life reminds us that human history is more than events. It is a network of power, control, and resilience. Each act of domination leaves a shadow that extends across time. Each coerced life carries lessons about systemic manipulation and the fragility of autonomy under extreme structures of power. By studying these stories, we gain insight not only into the past but into the mechanics of influence, obedience, and control that shape societies today. Awareness, reflection, and action are the only antidotes to such enduring machinery. As we close this exploration, remember that Pata Seca was more than a statistic. He was a man, a father, a survivor. His story is horrifying, yes, but it is also illuminating. It forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human systems, the capacity for cruelty, and the resilience of the human spirit. And as you reflect on his life, consider what it teaches about vigilance, awareness, and the courage to see the world as it truly is, a complex interplays. You have power, survival, and resistance. This is the legacy of Pata Seca, a life engineered for exploitation, endured with awareness, and remembered as a warning, a lesson, and an awakening. What he endured is almost unimaginable, but what his story offers us is clarity. And clarity, once attained, cannot be unseen. It changes perception, reshapes understanding, and awakens the mind to truths that were never meant to be known.